She had been given 3 rules by the women who prepared her. Do not speak. Unless spoken to, do not touch what is not assigned to you. Do not look at his face directly. Humans took eye contact as a challenge, and a challenged human was a dangerous one. Sira had memorized these rules the way she had memorized all rules completely, quietly, the way a person memorizes the location of every exit in a room they are locked inside. The transfer took 11 minutes. She stood in the processing bay of Colonial Station Arden while 2 officials passed documents back and forth over her head. Her Velhari escort stood to her left. The human liaison stood to her right. Neither of them spoke to her. She was the subject of the documents, not a participant in them. She kept her hands folded, her eyes down, her breathing small. The official pressed a seal to the last page. The Velhari escort turned and left without a word. No farewell, no backward glance. She had not expected one. She had not been with that household long enough to earn one. Then there was a pause. She waited for the next instruction. Instead, something warm appeared in her peripheral vision. A cup being held out to her by a hand that was waiting, not pushing. She looked up, careful, angled, not direct, and saw him for the first time. Marcus Hale was not what the briefing images had shown. The images had been official, stiff, a man performing the role of colonial liaison for a camera. This was something else. He was tall in the way that came from years of work rather than birth. His face was tired in a specific way, not the tiredness of weakness, but of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had simply stopped noticing the weight. He was holding the cup the way person holds something they intend to give away. You've been traveling for 9 hours, he said. Sit down. It was not a command. The shape of it was wrong for a command. It sat somewhere between an observation and an invitation, and Sira did not have a rule for that, so she stood very still and did not sit and did not take the cup. He set the cup on the processing counter beside her, left it there, turned to finish the paperwork. She looked at the cup. Steam rose from it in a thin straight line. She did not touch it. The quarters were on the 4th residential ring. He walked slightly ahead, not fast, not performing, just moving with the efficient stride of someone who knew where he was going. She followed at the correct distance, 2 steps behind, left side. She had been taught the proper following position for a bonded female in a new household. He stopped at a door, pressed his hand to the panel, looked back at her with a brief, unreadable expression. When he noticed how far behind she was, he didn't say anything. He pushed the door open and stepped aside so she could enter first. She entered. The quarters were modest by colonial standards, she understood, though she had little frame of reference for colonial standards. There was a main room with a low table and 2 chairs, narrow kitchen space along the back wall, a single door to the left that presumably led to the sleeping room. It was tidy, not the tidiness of someone who had prepared for a visitor, the tidiness of someone who simply lived that way. She stood in the center of the main room and waited. He walked past her and opened the left door. Sleeping room. 1 bed pushed against the far wall, a window, a second smaller table. This half is yours, he said, indicating generally the right side of the room. The smaller table, the space near the window. I cleared the storage. You can use the drawers, she processed. this information carefully. Then she asked formally with the correct honorific, the way she had been trained, which of his belongings in the main room were permitted and which were restricted. Zones. He turned and looked at her. Look lasted several seconds. She couldn't read it fully. It wasn't anger. It wasn't contempt. It was something that moved through his face like weather, and then was gone. It's a room, he said. There are no zones. She held this answer in her mind, turned it carefully, looking for the structure beneath it. There had to be a structure. All spaces had zones. All households had rules about objects. She had learned the hard way what happened when she guessed wrong about which things were allowed. She reached into the small bag she had carried from the transport and took out her ledger, a slim, worn thing. She had been keeping it since she was 12. She wrote down his answer exactly as he had said it. No zonas. She would not trust her memory with something this important. When she looked up, he was watching her right. His expression was the same, unreadable. Whether he said nothing, he went to the kitchen and began doing something with his hands, preparing food. She realized the sounds were quiet and routine, the sounds of someone following a pattern they had followed many times before. She stood in the center of the room for a while longer. Then, because she did not have an assigned place to be, she went and stood near the window and watched the station's outer ring turn slowly against the dark. She didn't sleep in the bed. It wasn't that she thought he would object. It was something older and more physical than thought, a body that had learned not to take the offered thing because the offered thing was often a test, and failing the test was worse than refusing the offer. She folded herself into the space beside the bed on the floor with the small blanket she had brought from her traveling bag. The floor was clean, warmer than most floors she had used. She lay there in the dark and went over the rules. No zones. Sit down. You've been traveling. None of them fit the shape of rules she knew. She was still trying to fit them when she fell asleep. He found her there in the morning. She heard him stop in the doorway, heard the quality of his silence change. She was already awake. She was always awake before the household stirred, had trained herself to be. It was safer that way, and she lay still and waited to understand what the silence meant. It lasted a long time. Then he walked away, back to the kitchen. The same sounds as the night before, quiet and routine, the sounds of a pattern continuing. She listened to those sounds and felt something she could not name press lightly against the inside of her chest. Not comfort, not yet, but close to something that might become it if she was very careful and very still and did not ruin it by wanting it too much. She got up, folded her blanket, went to stand in the doorway of the kitchen. He looked up from what he was doing, slid a plate toward the edge of the counter, said nothing. She looked at the plate, then at him, then at the plate. She did not know what she had done to earn it. She did not ask. She was afraid of the answer. The first thing she learned about Marcus Hale was that he cooked for two every time, without announcement, without condition. He moved around the small kitchen like a man following a ritual he had invented for himself, and at the end of it there were always two plates, two cups, two sets of everything, as if the arithmetic of the household had always included her, and he was simply catching up to a fact that already existed. The first time he slid a plate toward her, she had asked carefully, formally, with the correct honorific, what she had done. To earn it, he had looked at her. The look was the same one from the morning. He found her on the floor, the weather moving through his face without landing anywhere she could read. It's called dinner, he said, and went back to eating. She ate, standing at the counter because she did not know if the chair was hers to use. He didn't correct her. He also didn't look at her standing there in a way that suggested it was normal. There was something careful happening behind his eyes, something that noticed without announcing itself. She wrote in her ledger that evening: dinner, no prior task required, chair status unclear. 2 weeks passed. She learned his routine, the way she had learned every household's routine, by watching, cataloging, building a map of expectations so she could move through the space without causing disruption. He woke early, made the same thing for breakfast most days, spent mornings on colonial correspondence, left for the station offices in the early afternoon, returned before dark. He did not give her tasks. This was the part she couldn't map. Every household she had lived in had a task structure, things she was expected to do, times she was expected to do them, standards she was expected to meet. Failing the task structure had consequences. The consequences varied by household, but the structure itself was constant. It was the grammar of how she existed in a space. Marcus had no task structure. She created one anyway. She cleaned what needed cleaning. She learned things were kept and kept them there. She managed the household schedule, tracking his correspondence commitments and reminding him of nothing, because she did not know yet if he wanted reminders or found them intrusive, but keeping the information available in case he asked. He didn't ask. He also didn't object. She occupied the space between those two things and tried not to take up too much room. On the 9th day she broke something. It was on the shelf above his desk, a small dark object, curved, made of some material she didn't recognize. She had been cleaning the shelf and her cloth caught the edge of it, and it went over and hit the floor and split into 3 pieces. She stood over it. Everything in her went very still. She knew this moment. The shape of it was familiar in her bones. She did not move. She did not try to pick the pieces up. That was sometimes worse, handling the broken thing, leaving fingerprints on the damage. Better to stand, better to wait, better to already be in the correct posture for what came next. She heard him come to the doorway. She kept her eyes on the pieces. The silence stretched. That was my sister's, he said, not loud, not sharp. The words came out the way something comes out when it has been sitting in a person for a long time, and the weight of it is familiar. She braced. He walked past her, crouched down, picked up the 3 pieces one at a time, with the care of someone handling something that mattered. He held them in his palm and looked at them for a moment. Then he set them on the desk and went back to his work. That was all. She stood in the same spot for a long time after. The consequence she had prepared for, the catalog of possible responses she had assembled and pre-accepted, none of it came. He had absorbed the loss without distributing any part of it. The grief in his hands had been real and quiet and pointed entirely inward. She had never seen that before. She wrote in her ledger, broken object, sisters, no consequence assigned. Grief kept internally. Then she stared at what she had written. She didn't know what rule to draw from it. He asked her opinion on a Thursday. not about anything large. He was reviewing a supply manifest, colonial logistics, the kind of dry numerical work that filled his mornings, and he read something aloud, and then looked up at her and said, "What do you think?" She had been standing near the window, doing nothing, occupying the space the way she had learned to occupy spaces, present but not imposing. She thought he had spoken to someone else. She looked around the room. There was no one else. "I'm asking you," he said, with the patient tone of someone who had time to wait. She told him briefly. She had been listening to him work for 2 weeks without appearing to, and she had thoughts she had not considered expressing, and they came out careful and small and technically accurate. He nodded, used the information, wrote something down. "Good," he said. She stood at the window for a long time. After that, facing away from him, looking at the slow turn of the outer ring. Something strange was happening in her chest, something she kept trying to identify and kept failing to. Later she decided it was the feeling of being heard by a person who had not needed anything from her. First, she had no word for that. In the Velhari she had grown up speaking, she wasn't sure there was one. On a Tuesday evening 3 weeks, and she reached for the bread at dinner without thinking. Halfway through the reach, her hand stopped. She had not asked. She had not been offered. She had simply, without calculation, without checking, started to take a thing because she wanted it. She went very still. She waited. He was looking at his screen across the table, reading something. His cup was halfway to his mouth. He completed the motion, set the cup down, turned a page. He did not look up. She remained motionless for a moment longer. Then slowly, with the careful disbelief of someone diffusing something, she completed the reach, took the bread, brought it back to her plate. She didn't taste it. She was too busy listening for the correction. The correction did not come. He set down his screen eventually and looked at her plate, which was now nearly empty, and said, "The soup's better warm. I can heat it." She looked at the soup. It had been sitting a while. "Yes," she said. "Please." He got up and heated the soup and set it back down in front of her and went back to reading, and she sat there in the warm, quiet, ordinary fact of it and felt something shift deep and structural, like a wall deciding to become a door. And she did not write in her ledger that night because she didn't know what rule to record. For the first time in a very long time she had no rule. She just had the soup, warm, as it should have been. As it turned out, she was allowed to have it. The summons came on a Wednesday, and Marcus told her about it over breakfast. A Velhari trade dispute, 2 merchant houses fighting over transit rights through colonial space. He had been assigned as mediator, which was the kind of work the colonial authority gave him because he was good at it, good at sitting across a table from people who were angry and not becoming angry himself, good at finding the precise place where 2 sides could both feel like they had won something without either of them having won much. He told her she was expected to attend protocol, he said, without apology or elaboration. Bonded partner accompanies the liaison at formal sessions. "If you'd rather not, I'll attend," she said. She said it before he finished the sentence. She said it the way she had learned to say yes to things, preemptively, cleanly, closing the space before a preference could be inferred. From a hesitation, he looked at her for a moment. the weather in his face brief and unreadable. "All right," he said, and finished his breakfast. The mediation session was held in one of the station's formal chambers, a long table, high walls, the kind of room designed to make everything inside it feel permanent and significant. The two Velhari merchant delegations sat on opposite ends. Advisors stood along the walls. Translators sat at the corners. She had been in rooms like this before, not at the table, never at the table, but along the walls, among the advisors and attendants, in the posture of furniture. She took her place to Marcus's left, half a step back, the correct position for a bonded partner in a formal Velhari setting. Not quite invisible, not quite present. He glanced at her position, said nothing. The session began. She watched him work. She had seen the correspondence, the manifests, the quiet machinery of his thinking, but she had not seen this. He was different in the room. Not louder, not more forceful. If anything, he was quieter, and the quiet had weight to it. He asked questions that seemed simple and were not. He let both sides talk longer than they expected to be allowed. And in the talking they said things they had not intended to say, and he collected those things without appearing to. The dispute was at its core about which house had established prior transit rights through a colonial relay corridor. Both houses claimed records. Both records had gaps. She knew the answer. She had known it within the first 20 minutes because she had listened to enough trade disputes in enough antechambers to understand the structures underneath them. And this one had a shape she recognized. She kept the knowledge in her hands, folded, quiet. It wasn't her place to speak. An hour in, during a brief recess, Marcus turned to her. "You've been thinking since the opening arguments," he said, not accusing, just stating. She looked at him. "What do you have?" he said. The room was partially cleared. Advisors at the edges, the delegations in separate corners, low voices. The official translator was refilling glass at the far wall. "The Hithari record," she said, keeping her voice small. "Their claim references the third transit compact as establishing priority, but the third compact specifically excluded relay corridors under joint colonial development at the time of signing. The relay corridor in question was under joint development status for another 11 years after the compact was finalized. Their own cited document invalidates their position." He was quiet. "Which means," she added carefully, "the dispute is already resolved. They simply haven't read their own documentation closely enough to know it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then the session resumed. He called on her in front of everyone, in the formal chamber with both delegations at the table and the advisors along the walls, and the translators at the corners. Marcus Hale turned to the woman standing half a step behind his left shoulder and said in the clear, unperformed tone he used for everything, "My wife has a reading of the documentation. I'd like to put on record." The room changed temperature. Both delegations turned. The reaction moved through the Velhari attendees like current through water, a collective stillness. The particular stillness of people witnessing something that was not supposed to happen. A Velhari bonded female consulted in a formal session. Named, she felt it land on her like light. She didn't know how to stand inside. "The floor is yours." Marcus said in the same ordinary voice. She spoke quietly, precisely. The same words she had said to him in the recess now given to the room. The room was very still by the time she finished. The lead delegate of the HFY house looked down at his documents. His expression made a slow, private journey. The session concluded 40 minutes later. On the transport home, the lead delegate from the other house filed a formal objection, not about the ruling, about the consultation. The liaison's bonded partner has no recognized standing in formal mediation proceedings. The objection stated the consultation was irregular and the record should reflect that the liaison acted outside an established protocol. Marcus read the objection on his screen. His face was the face he always had, still tired in the familiar way, unimpressed with the weight of whatever he was carrying. He filed his response. She did not see what it said. She almost asked. Instead, she watched the station lights move past the viewport and thought about the older Velhari woman who had been the chamber, not from either delegation, an observer. She had been seated near the back, high enough in status to merit a chair, but positioned in the observer section, and she had watched the moment of consultation with an expression that was not anger and was not surprise. It was something closer to recognition. On the transport, after a long silence, she asked him why. She said, "You didn't have to consult me. You had enough." He was looking at his screen. He set it down. "I didn't have enough." He said, "You had the rest of it. I could have passed the information quietly. You didn't have to name me." He was quiet for a moment. The transport moved through the corridor between rings, and the light shifted and his face was briefly unreadable. "I could have," he said. He picked up his screen again. She turned back to the viewport. It was not an answer. It was the outline of one, the shape of something she would have to sit with until she understood the dimensions of it. She sat with it all the way home. She sat with it through dinner, which he made the same as always: 2 plates, 2 cups, the quiet arithmetic of a household that had always included her. And later, when she lay in the bed she had been sleeping in the bed for 3 weeks now, carefully, as if it might still be revoked, she thought about the older Velhari woman's face, that look that wasn't anger. She had seen many kinds of fear in her life, many kinds of resignation, and GT clears throat, and GT many kinds of performance. That look had been none of those things. She thought about it for 3 days before she understood what it was. It was the look of someone watching a door open in a wall they had long since stopped believing had doors. The envoy arrived on a morning when the station was doing routine maintenance on the outer ring, which meant the lights cycled amber instead of white, and every corridor had that particular underwater quality of place waiting to return to normal. There were 3 of them, a formal representative of the Velhari conclave, 2 legal witnesses, and a document case that she knew the shape of before they opened it. She had been expecting this, not consciously, but somewhere in the body below thought. She had been expecting it since the mediation session, since the filed objection, since she allowed herself to believe that what was happening in this household was permanent. Some older part of her had known that the believing was the dangerous thing, that the moment she stopped treating the safety as borrowed was the moment it would be taken back. She stood in the main room while Marcus read the Documents, she kept her hands folded. Her eyes down, she had not planned to do either of those things. Her body had simply remembered what posture was appropriate for this moment. The documents were precise. The peace binding marriage, the envoy argued, had been improperly formalized under Velhari conclave law. Specifically, no formal bond token had been registered. At the time of the transfer, a bond token was required for the marriage to be recognized as binding by conclave authority. Without conclave recognition, the transfer to colonial custody was provisional. Provisional transfers could be recalled within a 6-month window. They were still inside the window. She already knew she would go. She had always known on some level that she would go, because that was how things went. Not because she deserved it. Not because it was just because the structure of the world was the structure of the world, and she had survived inside it by accepting the shape of it, rather than fighting the weight. I understand, she said when Marcus put the documents down. He looked at her. I know this is difficult, she continued. Her voice was very steady. She had practiced this voice for years. I recognize the political position it creates. I want you to know I'm prepared to. Sarah, she stopped. His voice was gentle in the way it sometimes was when she was doing the thing, the preemptive yes, the practiced exit, the way he had of saying her name that was not quite an interruption but was a door closing on the sentence before it reached somewhere they couldn't come back from. I'm not sending you back, he said. The envoy was still in the room, all three of them listening. She looked at him. She needed to understand. She needed the logic, the clause, the legal argument, the political calculus that made this position sustainable. There had to be a reason that would hold. She needed to write it in the ledger and know it would stay true. Why, she asked. He held the documents in his hands. The amber maintenance light moved across his face. Because it's wrong, he said. And I still know the difference. He was awake all night. She knew because she heard it, the specific quality of a dark and quiet apartment that contains a person who is not sleeping. The absence of the slow, regular sounds she had memorized over months, the occasional movement, the screen lighting. Up in the other room, she did not go out. She lay in the bed and listened to him work and felt the weight of it sit on her chest and had no rule for what she was feeling and no ledger entry that covered it. In the morning, the table was covered in documents, colonial law, conclave treaty provisions, liaison authority statutes, human marriage law, and its 7 sub-classifications, and its 42 procedural clauses. He had not been reviewing the case. He had been dismantling it piece by piece, looking for the place where it collapsed. She stood in the doorway and looked at the table. He came in from the kitchen with 2 cups, set one near her, sat down at the table, and picked up his screen. She sat down in the chair that was hers, that she knew now was hers. There's a problem, he said without looking up. The bond token, she said. Yes, she had been thinking about it since the night before. A bond token was a formality, registered object that symbolized the formal union. The colonial authority had never required one because human marriage law didn't use them. The Velhari conclave had simply not been consulted at the time of the transfer about whether their formality had been observed, an oversight small enough to be an accident, significant enough to be. A door, can one be registered retroactively? She asked. Under colonial law, yes. With documentation of intent at the time of union, and under conclave law. Under conclave law, he said, a bond token must be a physical object of personal significance to both parties. Something real. And he set down his screen. He reached into the inside pocket of the jacket that had been hanging on the back of his chair since the morning after the envoy arrived. She had noticed it, had not commented, and he set something on the table between them. She looked at it. Small, dark, curved, made of a material she recognized now because she had watched him pick up the pieces of it from the floor 2 months ago and hold them in his palm with the particular care of someone handling something that mattered. His sister's ring repaired. The joint was nearly invisible. Careful work. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at him. When? She asked. A few days after you broke it. You didn't say anything. No, she didn't ask why. She thought she understood why. And asking would have made them both look directly at it, and she wasn't certain she could hold the shape of what she understood without it changing the structure of something inside her that still needed to be careful. I filed it as the formal bond token last night, he said. Registration timestamp predates the envoy's arrival by 4 months. She absorbed this. You registered it 4 months ago. Retroactive documentation of intent at the time of union. Colonial Statute, subsection 9. He picked up his screen. It's a very well-written subsection. The hearing was brief. The colonial legal chamber was smaller than the mediation room. Fewer chairs. Better lighting. A single adjudicator at the head of the table, and the Velhari envoy on one side and Marcus on the other, and she sat beside him because this time she knew the chair was hers. The bond token registration was submitted. The envoy's counsel objected. The registration was retroactive. The timeline suspicious. The documentation. The adjudicator held up one hand. Human marriage law, she explained in the even tone of someone who had made this speech before. Recognized formal bond tokens as valid upon registration, provided documentation of intent was established. The documentation before the court established intent clearly. The Velhari conclave's position that the marriage was provisional did not align with the marriage's standing under the governing legal framework, which in colonial space was colonial law. She cited 7 clauses. She cited a sub-provision in the original colonial charter specifically addressing the conflict of law principle in cases involving interspecies unions. She cited a secondary sub-provision that seemed to have been written by someone who had once been very angry about exactly this kind of situation and had decided to do something thorough about it. The case was dismissed. The envoy and his witnesses left without looking at Sarah. She sat very still in her chair for a moment after the room cleared. Marcus gathered his documents without urgency outside the chamber. In the corridor he stopped, reached into his pocket, held out the ring, not placed on her finger, not assumed, held in his open hand, offered, waiting for a direction. She looked at it, at him, at the repaired seam where the broken thing had been made whole. She took it. She put it on her own hand, on the finger she chose, and she stood in the amber-lit corridor with the ring on her hand and something large and old and patient finally exhaling out of her chest. She didn't say anything, she didn't have to. He had always been very good at letting things stand without making them say more than they were. He walked. She walked beside him, not half a step behind, not to the left at the correct following distance beside him, down the corridor. Toward home, 6 months is not enough. Time to unlearn 20 years, she knew that. She did not expect it. Healing, she had come to understand, was not the erasure of the trained thing, but the slow, patient addition of something else, layer by layer, the way a wall gets covered until you can no longer see the original surface. The original surface was still there. It would always be there. But you did not have to live looking at it. She had stopped sleeping on the floor. She had stopped asking permission to eat. She had started on certain evenings when the station was quiet and the food was good and the light in the apartment had that specific amber quality she now associated with safety. She had started telling him things, small things, a thought about the manifest he was reviewing, something she had read, an observation about the way the outer ring moved that she had been carrying for weeks without knowing she was allowed to put it down somewhere. He received these things the way he received everything, quietly, with the attention of someone for whom listening was not a performance. She had begun to understand that this was the rarest thing he had. Not intelligence, not patience, not even the legal architecture he had built around her, clause by clause, like someone constructing a shelter from the outside in. The rarest thing was that he listened without needing anything back. She had not known before him that this was possible. She had thought listening was always a transaction. The message from Councilwoman Oreth came through official colonial channels, which was how she had asked it to be routed when they first made contact. Oreth was the older Velhari woman from the mediation chamber, the one with the look that wasn't anger. They had been corresponding for 3 months through the formal channel, careful, sparse messages. Nothing that couldn't be read by anyone. Nothing that couldn't be explained. The kind of correspondence that was not itself the thing but was the outer edge of the thing. Oreth was one of 6. The network had no name. It did not need one because unnamed things were much harder to locate, and they had all learned very early how to keep things that mattered away from the eyes that were always looking. They moved Velhari females into colonial-aligned space, quietly through the gaps in 3 different legal frameworks that, taken together, created a space wide enough for a person to slip through if they knew exactly where to step. Marcus had found the gaps. She had not asked him to. He had, simply because he was who he was, gone looking. The colonial authorities' documentation system allowed for emergency humanitarian sponsorship in cases of documented distress. Velhari Conclave's own treaty provisions included a clause about voluntary relocation that had never been intended to be used this way and was absolutely valid for this purpose. And human marriage law, which was structured like a labyrinth built by someone with a very specific grudge, made interfering with the spousal documentation of a colonial citizen a procedural nightmare that required approximately 9 forms, 4 hearings, and the approval of a committee that met once every 2 months. It was, as Marcus had noted with the particular dry tone she now knew meant he was pleased about something, a very well-designed system. The girl arrived on a Thursday. She was young, Sarah's age, when the household assignment had begun. She had been traveling for 14 hours. She stood in the doorway of the apartment in the correct posture, hands folded, eyes down, body arranged into the shape of something that was trying not to take up space. And Sarah looked at her from across the room and recognized her the way you recognize something you used to be. She walked to the kitchen. She came back with a cup. She held it out in the direction of the girl, not pushing, not demanding, just present and waiting, and she said, in plain and simple words, "You've been traveling a long time. Sit down," not a command. The girl looked at the cup, at Sarah. The cup. She took it. She did not sit, but she took it. That was enough. Sarah knew how these things worked, not in a line, not on a schedule, but in small increments of belief, each one replacing a fraction of the fear. The girl's name was Veth. She stayed for 6 days. At the end of those 6 days, she was moved through 3 carefully unremarkable steps to a colonial settlement on Arden's sister station, where a human family with a documented sponsorship history was expecting her. 2 weeks later, another. Then another. The network grew the way it had always grown, not through announcement, but through the oldest mechanism there was. One person told one person. That person told one more. The circle widened by trust and nothing else. On a night when the apartment was quiet and dinner was finished and the ring sat on her finger with the comfortable weight of a thing she had stopped noticing, because that was how you knew something was truly yours, when you stopped noticing its presence and only registered its absence. She said, "Since I was 12, rules I was allowed to follow. What was mine and what was forbidden. When to speak and when to be quiet. What posture to take in which kind of room." He was listening the way he always listened. I wrote everything down because I didn't trust my own memory with things that important. Getting the rules wrong had consequences, and I needed to be certain. She looked at her hands on the table. The ring. The hands. "I haven't written in it in 4 months. He was quiet. "What happened to it?" he asked. She thought about this. "I stopped needing it," she said, which was not quite the whole answer, but was the part of the answer she had words for. He waited in case there was more. "I ran out of things I was afraid of," she said, which was not quite true. She was still afraid of things. Sometimes the old reflexes fired, and she found herself braced for something that wasn't coming. Found herself going small in a room that had no threat in it. She suspected that would continue for a long time. Maybe always, but the fear was no longer the largest thing in the room. He was sitting across the table, the same table as the first dinner, which she had eaten standing at the counter because she didn't know the chair was hers, the same cup she had not taken from his hand in the processing bay on a day that was both very recent and impossibly far away. He looked at her with the expression she had learned to read over months of watching his face, the one that moved through like weather and always resolved into the same thing. Quiet, steady, the expression of someone who was simply, he said, that was all. It was enough. It had always been enough. With him, the small, sufficient word, the acknowledgement that didn't oversell itself, that didn't require her to feel more than she felt or say more than she had. She picked up her cup outside the viewport, the station's outer ring, turned against the dark, slow, steady, the same as always. Inside, 2 people at a table, a cup each. The ordinary fact of an evening. She had A ledger with 20 years of rules in it. That she no longer needed, she thought. Very briefly, about writing one last entry. She thought about what it would say, then she set down the cup and decided she already knew what it would say and that it did not need to be written down. She would remember it. This one, she was certain of, she would remember it just fine.